And in the previous video we have seen that what happens if we use an if else statement. So if we have some condition, we use an if else statement. So what about if I have multiple conditions, like if condition 1 is true, then I have to execute particular code, and then if condition 2 is true, then I have to execute a particular code, and then if condition 3 is true, and then I have to execute a particular block of code. So this could be done via an else if keyword. Okay, so what I'll do is I'll just create a main function, and inside the main function I'll create a variable that is equals to 5, and what I'll do is I'll create some conditions such as if I is equals to 5, then I have to print that I is 5. Okay, and then again else if I'll use the keyword else if, and then pass the condition if I is equals to 4, else if I is equals to 4, I have to print I is 4. Okay, so I can do that, and there could be as many number of if else block as required. So I can use, like here, as many if else block I required, else if block I required. So I'll just make that I is 3. Okay, then again I'll use the keyword else if I is equals to 2, then I have to print that I is 2. Then again else if I is equals to 1, then I have to print I is 1. Okay, so at the end of the if else block or else if block, we must end it with a uh, else statement. So like what I am trying to say is else block is optional as said for if else statement. So we can skip the else block in if else statement as well as when we use the if else ladder or the else if blocks. Okay, so I can here include the else statement, or I can choose to skip that. Print, I can choose the else statement like print I is not in 1 to 5. Okay, so I'll just uh, change the value of I to 6 and then run this program. So we can see here that the output is I is not in 1 to 5 as mentioned in the else statement. So when I change the value to 5, it will print that I is 5. So the conditions are evaluated sequentially from top to bottom, and if a condition is evaluated as false, the execution continues with the evaluation of subsequent condition. Okay, so from here we enter in this code, and we enter in this if else ladder. So the first condition is evaluated, and if the first condition is true, then we get out of the if else ladder, and if the first condition is false, we evaluate with the subsequent and the second condition. Okay, and if the second condition, if the and if any condition is true, the corresponding block against the statement is executed, and we are out of the if else ladder. And if none of the conditions evaluate to true, runtime executes else block, and that too if else block is present. So as I change the value of I to 6, the else block gets executed, because every condition is false in that particular case. So that was if else ladder, Kotlin if else ladder. So we can see here that the IDE is underlining this with a green. So what it is saying when I hover over it, it's saying that cascade if should be replaced with when. So don't you think that this code is a little bit of redundant? Like we are using else if a lot of times. And suppose that I have 20 conditions. So then I have to repeat 20 else if blocks. So when I go to if statement, it shows that we should use when. So now we will move on and study the keyword when. So instead of doing this, I'll just comment it out. What I can do is I can use the keyword when, and then what to check. So like I'll just open parenthesis and write the variable that I have to check. Okay, so when I, okay, and then I'll open this code, and then I'll provide the values of I, and if I is 1, okay, so then I'll just use hyphen and greater than sign, and then I'll open a code block, and then I'll write println I is 1. Okay, so what this when block does is, when I enter this when statement, it assigns a condition that when I is 1. Okay, so when I write below that 2, and then I open a code block. Okay, so what it will do is, it will it will execute this statement when I is 2. Okay, so like this is just one liner code, so I have to write just print code. So I will not use the curly braces. I'll just type that when I is 3, println I is 3. Okay, when I is 4, println I is 4, and when I is 5, println I is 5. Okay, so after all of this, what I can do is I can just use an else statement. So what if any of this is not true? Like I is not equals to 1, 2, 3, or 4 or 5. Okay, so I'll just use else statement, and I'll also have to use the hyphen and the greater than sign for that. Okay, and I can use the curly braces if I want, and I can write that I is not in I is not in 1 to 5. Okay, so when I execute this code, so I is 5, and then we enter this when I block, and then it checks that whether I is 1 or not, then whether I is 2 or not, then whether I is 3 or not. So after checking and getting this as false, it checks that whether I is 5 or not. So I is 5 in this case, and then it prints that I is 5, and then it gets out of this when function or when keyword. Okay, so when I provide that I is equals to 6, okay, and run this. So I have not mentioned here what to print when I is 6, but I have mentioned that what to print when I is not in 1 to 5, which is the else statement. So that prints that. But what happens when I don't use the else keyword? Okay, so when I don't use the else keyword and the I is 6, what happens is the codes get executed and it does not print anything. So when else keyword is not required, so I don't have to mention else keyword, and it is not necessary, but it is a good practice, as if the condition is not true, if any condition is not true, there is something to execute. Otherwise nothing will be executed. Okay, so after that we have nested if else. So what happens if I have condition 1 and condition 2? So I have like if condition 1 is true, then I have to check second condition. So in that case we use nested if else. We can nest an if else statement inside another if else statement. When we say if else, in this context it could be if statement or if else statement or if else if statement. Okay, so I'll just use an example for this nested if else. So if I is 5, okay, I'll use to okay, if I is 5, and then I have to check that if I is odd or not. So that doesn't make sense, but for understanding purpose it should make sense. So if I is divisible by, if I is divisible by 2, I have to check that. So if I divided by 2 is 0, so then I is even. So I have to print ln that I is 5 and even. Okay, and I can just do that also, but as I mentioned that using an else statement is a good practice. So else println I is 5 and odd, and I can again use an else statement here, that println I is not equal to 5. Okay, so when I run this function or run this code, what I'll find is it prints the statement I is not equal to 5, because I have mentioned that I is equals to 6. I'll just go ahead and change the variable I is equals to 5 and then again run this statement. Okay, so I can find the output is I is 5 and odd, because I is 5 and odd. Okay, so here you can see that I have nested an if else statement under an if else statement. Okay, so if this is the case, then I have to check that if this is the case or not, and if this is not the case, then I have to print this. Okay, so this is the example for nested if else, and in this video we have covered what is nested if else, what is if else ladder, and when to use when keyword. Thank you for watching this video.